Hey guys, so this lesson is about interactions within a community, and this is my second time filming it because the first time the PowerPoint didn't show up on the recording. So fingers crossed it works this time, or else you guys are just going to be listening to me and following along on your own PowerPoints. So let's get into it. Okay, so like I said, this is all about interactions within the community. We're going to start by quickly defining what community is. We'll also review what intraspecific versus interspecific mean. And then we're going to look at intraspecific competition, interspecific competition, predator-prey cycles, different ways that predation affects ecosystems, including the evolution of defense mechanisms, and then we'll finish off by briefly touching on symbiotic relationships. So just a reminder, community refers to a group of different populations of different species interacting with one another in a habitat or an ecosystem, and that community can change based on immigration, emigration, natural selection, mating, all that kind of stuff. The ecosystem itself can also change based on disturbances and natural phenomenon and all those different things. So communities are often changing and adapting as populations interact with one another. Intraspecific interactions are any interactions that occur between members of the same species. A big one is intraspecific competition, where members of the same species compete for access to mates or water, shelter, food, nutrients, sunlight, all those different things. Intraspecific competition is a density-dependent factor. So it tends to be one of the things that keep K-selected populations at carrying capacity. Parents who are really strong competitors tend to live long and reproduce more, so they tend to pass on those traits to more offspring. And so that could result in a lot of competition between offspring and parents who are both really good competitors. And so a lot of species have evolved ways in order to get offspring away from parents to reduce that type of competition. In animals, offspring are sometimes expected to leave their parents' population and go join a different population or start their own group. In plants, seed dispersion can be really important in that process. There's also some different strategies that have evolved where different members of the same species will use different strategies to try and outcompete each other. So when competing with other males for mates, there are kind of two main strategies. Some males will just go like based on like strength and try and go that like alpha male route. And other males have developed a different strategy, and they are called sneaker males. That's nothing to do with running shoes, it's to do with sneaking. And essentially what those males do is they just appear really unthreatening to kind of fly below the radar of the alpha males. Sometimes they actually appear and behave like females so that they can get close to females without drawing any of the alpha male's attention. Sometimes you'll also have different traits evolve within different members of the same species. So one example of that is birds that can evolve to have slightly different shaped beaks in order to be able to make use of different size seeds and nuts and that sort of thing. If that is prolonged, it will actually result in speciation, or the developing of new species. Kin selection is another type of intraspecific interaction where an individual will give up their time or energy or resources to help their relatives, which can happen between parents and offspring, but also between like aunts and uncles and more distantly related relatives. In order for this to happen, the cost to the individual, so the energy or resources that that individual is giving up must be outweighed by the benefit of having their genes passed on to the next generation. So usually you see this in individuals that aren't able to survive or reproduce on their own. So for instance, there might be like an uncle that hasn't been able to find a mate, so has no children of his own, and therefore might help raise his sister's children, so that more of her offspring make it into the next generation, carrying his genes with them. There's also something called altruism, where an individual does something for someone else and it doesn't benefit them at all. That kind of altruism is super rare in nature. You see it in humans sometimes, but most species don't exhibit true altruism, where you're just doing something completely selflessly. But there is something called reciprocal altruism, which is when an individual does something beneficial for someone else, with the understanding that that favor will be returned sometime in the future. This usually happens in really close-knit communities that kind of rely on one another for survival. And it has to happen in communities where they can actually recognize each other, so that they can tell who it is that owes them a favor, essentially. So this includes things like warning calls, like if you see a predator and you scream to warn other people or individuals, that will kind of draw the attention of the predator to you, so it's risky, but you're doing that with the understanding that in the future, if there's a predator sneaking up behind you, someone will yell and warn you. It also includes things like feeding weaker members of the population, which happens in bats a lot of the time, that if one bat is like too weak or sick to go out and get food, other members of the population will go out, eat, and then come back and vomit up some of their meal for that injured member of their community, in the hopes that if they're ever too sick, someone would do the same for them. Even more selfless is the Malaysian carpenter ant, which will actually explode and kill themselves if they're attacked by a predator. And they do that because it covers the predator in this sticky, corrosive substance that allows the rest of their population to get away. And the point of doing that is so that hopefully more of your relatives can survive. Next up, we have interspecific interactions, which are happening between members of different species. There's three main types of interspecific interaction: interspecific competition, predation, and symbiosis. Competition, again, can happen anytime you have different species relying on the same resources. And this will happen anytime there's overlap in the niches of those different species. And anytime that resources are limited, so there's not enough to go around. There are two different types of interspecific competition. There is exploitative and interference. Exploitative is when the two competing species don't actually interact with each other directly. There's no direct contact. Instead, it's sometimes referred to as the lunch-dinner hypothesis or the lunch-dinner principle. It's this idea that if we are both competing for the same food and I go get it at breakfast and you wait until lunch, or I get it at lunch and you wait until dinner, I'm going to win the competition for that food just because I get to it first. And then interference is what we normally think of as competition. It's when there's some sort of direct interaction, some sort of like fight over the resource, and one will win and one will lose that fight. It's also called contest competition. And like I said, that'll happen anytime there's overlap between niches. A niche, just as a reminder, is any role or place that an individual or a species has in an environment. So it includes all its interactions with living and non-living things, how it survives, how it reproduces, how it accesses food and shelter, what it likes for food and shelter, all that kind of stuff. If there's no overlap, between the niches of different species, there will be no competition because they're not trying to go for the same thing. The more overlap there is between the niches, the more competition there will be. The competitive exclusion principle is this idea of what happens when you do have complete overlap between two niches. As we talked about in Bio 20, the only time you have that complete overlap of two niches when different species are overlapping like that would be if one was an invasive species. That doesn't naturally occur. But if you do have an invasive species that comes in and completely overlaps with the niche of another species, one of two things will happen. Either you'll have something called resource partitioning, where the species evolve to have different niches, or way more commonly, you'll have exclusion take place, where one species outcompetes the other. And then the winning species gets to stay and the losing species dies off. A lot of time, and the reason we worry about invasive species is that invasive species can often outcompete the native species. And we'll talk more about invasive species in a later lesson. And then the next type of interspecific interaction is predation, where you have a predator that consumes or eats a prey species. That is a density-dependent limiting factor. And predator and prey populations tend to cycle. That's what we call it, predator-prey cycles. So they tend to fluctuate together, usually with a slight lag on the predator population. So what'll happen is the predator population will be low. And so because of that, it allows the prey population to grow because there's not as many things eating them. And now with more prey species available, there's more food for the predators, so the predator population grows. And now that the predator population is really high, those predators start to eat the prey, so the prey population drops, and then that low prey population now can't support as many predators, so some of them die, so the predator population drops off. And it'll just keep going through that cycle over and over again. This is what it kind of looks like when we graph it out. So the prey population changes first, and then the predator population follows behind slightly. This is what it looks like more like in reality. Predation does have major impacts on the ecosystem. Obviously, predation affects the entire food web of an ecosystem. It's not just going to affect the species the predator is preying on, but also anything that that prey species eats, or any other predators that also eat that prey species. So there's a lot of interconnectedness within those food webs of an ecosystem. So one predator-prey relationship can affect the entire ecosystem. And then predation also acts as a selective force, like a type of natural selection, which can then drive evolution. Obviously, predation can kill off a lot of individuals of a prey species. And so anything that's killing off a lot of individuals is a selective force. If you have a trait that allows you to avoid getting eaten, then that's going to be selected for. If you are more vulnerable for some reason to the predators, then that trait is going to be selected against. And so this has resulted in the evolution of defense mechanisms. There's a couple different types of defense mechanisms, but that's any trait that protects an individual or a species from a predator. So there's morphological defenses, which are physical traits like spikes, hard shells, thorns. There's chemical defenses, which are like bad smells or tastes or toxins, like when monarch butterflies store toxins in their tissues and then taste bad to birds. There's passive defenses, like just hiding and avoiding the predators. There's active defenses, like running away, warning calls, puffing up your fur to make yourself look bigger, that kind of stuff. And then there's also something called coloration, which is just your natural color and how that protects you from predators. And there's three types of coloration. There's cryptic coloration, which is really just a camouflage. So that would be like this example up here. I don't know if you can see this frog is like camouflaged on like a rock or something. You can see like its eyeball right there. So that's cryptic coloration, just a good camouflage. Disruptive coloration is like these zebras up here. It's a really strongly contrasting pattern that makes it hard for the predator to tell where one individual ends and the next one starts and that kind of thing. And then the last one is like this frog down here. It's warning coloration, essentially having really bright colors or patterns that warn the predator that you're toxic or harmful in some way. With that, especially with the warning coloration, comes something called mimicry. So mimicry is when two or more species evolve to look similar as a defense mechanism against predators. Mullerian mimicry is when two or more dangerous species mimic the appearance of each other. So for instance, the monarch and the viceroy, which are very similar in how they look. And they're both toxic to birds. They both taste bad. The monarch even more so than the viceroy. But what happens is that by evolving to look the same, fewer individuals of each species has to die before a bird learns to stop eating them. If normally a bird has to eat 10 of something before it learns that it's bad, if the monarch and viceroy look different, that bird would have to eat 10 monarchs and 10 viceroy before it learned to stop eating them. But by looking the same, the bird might only have to eat 5 of each in order to learn that. So it saves how many individuals of each population die by looking the same. And then there's also something called Batesian mimicry, which is when a harmless species mimics a harmful one in order to protect itself. So that would be like this example at the top here. This is a fly, like perfectly harmless fly that is mimicking the appearance of a wasp, which obviously is harmful. So wasps have evolved to be harmful and to have that warning coloration, and then species learn to avoid wasps. And this fly is taking advantage of that. This fly has no other defense mechanism. It's not harmful, but it's tricking predators and other species into thinking it's harmful by mimicking the wasp. So these different defense mechanisms can result in something called an evolutionary arms race, which is when like the prey evolves some sort of defense mechanism and then the predator evolves a way to overcome it. So then the prey evolves another one, and then the predator evolves another one, and so on and so forth. And you have all of these traits co-evolving with one another. You also sometimes have it in males and females of the same species when there's a lot of forced matings and the females are trying to find ways of like getting away from males or getting rid of their sperm. There are like females that have evolved ways to actually like shoot sperm out of their vagina when they don't want that guy's stupid babies. So that can also result in an arms race. But yeah. Okay, the last type of interspecific interaction is symbiosis, which is any relationship between two different individuals where at least one of those individuals is benefiting. And you can take a peek at some of these examples down at the bottom here if you'd like, but we are going to go over each of the 3 types individually: mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. So mutualism is when both individuals in that symbiotic relationship benefit. Usually those species are dependent on one another for their survival. So for example, herbivores rely on the bacteria in their digestive system to digest plant material. So obviously the herbivores benefit by being able to eat plants, and the bacteria also benefit by having that habitat and that constant food supply. And another example is bees and flowers, where bees get nectar from flowers to make food, and the flowers get pollinated by the bees. Then there's commensalism, where one individual benefits and the other is unaffected. Some biologists don't believe that this actually exists. They think that there's one species that benefits and the other must also be benefiting or be harmed in some way, and we just don't understand how. But as far as you guys need to be concerned, commensalism exists. And an example of this are these birds right here and cows. So what happens is as cows are grazing, they're disturbing the grass or whatever, and it causes insects to come to the surface, and then this bird comes over and eats the insects. So the bird is benefiting from staying near the cow, and the cow's not affected by the bird's presence. And then the last type is parasitism, where one species benefits and the other is harmed. The harmed species is usually called the host, and usually isn't killed immediately, but is sometimes killed eventually. The parasite will sometimes directly kill the host eventually. Other times it just weakens the host, which means that it ends up dying because a predator eats it, or it's constantly outcompeted for resources and it starves to death. That would be examples like malaria and ticks and a lot of worms. But like I said, some parasites will just like eat the host from the inside out, and then it directly kills it. And then other parasites actually don't live in or on the host at all. They just take advantage of the host behavior, and that's called social parasitism. So cowbirds are an example of that. And in this nest up in the top corner here, you can see a cowbird egg in amongst 5 other eggs. And so what happens is this cowbird lays its egg in another bird's nest. The cowbird then doesn't have to waste any energy hatching this egg or raising this baby bird. Instead, this host bird ends up having to spend its time and energy on this bird. And cowbird babies grow much larger than other birds that they tend to be sharing a nest with. So the mother bird spends a ton of time and energy trying to feed this fat cowbird, and she ends up not being able to get enough food to the other baby birds because the cowbird tends to outcompete them for the food that she brings back. And so it ends up draining a lot of her energy, and it means that fewer of her offspring survive. So it is harmful to her, but the host isn't or the parasite isn't directly killing her or anything like that. Just by the way, if a consumer eats a plant, if it eats the whole plant, it's not considered parasitism, but if it only eats part of the plant, that is considered parasitism. And in the other corner up here, you can see a worm that has busted out of like a cricket or a grasshopper of some sort. That would be an example of the parasite directly killing its host. There are some really cool examples if you look online of parasites that like take over the minds of their host and cause them to do things that end up getting them killed. There's one, and I can't remember what it's called, but essentially the parasite like takes over the nervous system of the insect that it affects, and it causes the insect to burrow into a tree, but it causes it to dig a hole into the tree that's too narrow for the insect to fit, so the insect gets wedged in it, and then the parasite eats it from the inside out while it's still alive and then busts out of it. Cool stuff. Anyway, communities do usually live at a state of dynamic equilibrium, which, as we talked about in Bio 20, means that there's all of these tiny little changes happening, but overall the community or the population is stable. So biodiversity is maintained while all these little changes to population and species interactions are going on. That equilibrium can be disrupted by like natural disasters or human disturbances, that sort of thing, which can result in extinction, loss of biodiversity, a less healthy and less stable ecosystem, that sort of thing. And we're going to talk more in a later lesson about some of those disturbances that can happen. Okay, that's all. Thank you for following along with me.